Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The voice in the cabin. Last winter, I rented a remote cabin deep in the woods, hoping for a quiet getaway where I could unwind and enjoy the silence. The cabin was rustic, old-fashioned, surrounded by tall pines and a dense blanket of snow that muffled every sound. It felt like I was the only person in the world, isolated from everything, and for the first few days, it was perfect. But then, strange things began to happen. At night, I would hear noises outside, faint footsteps crunching in the snow, a soft shuffling that grew louder, then faded away, as though someone were circling the cabin. I told myself it was just animals, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, creeping over me like a chill. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper drifting through the silence. It was faint, like someone standing just outside the door, calling out in a voice filled with sorrow. I sat up, straining to listen, and the whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a haunting, breathy sound. "Come out," it whispered, the words drawn out, lingering in the air. I froze, my heart pounding, staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open. The voice continued, its tone desperate, pleading, filling me with a dread that seemed to sink into my bones. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard it, but the voice grew louder, each word echoing in the silence. "Please, come out." I stood, heart racing, and approached the door, peering through the small, frosted window. But all I could see was the empty forest, the trees casting long shadows over the snow. The whisper stopped, leaving only silence. But I felt its presence, a weight pressing down on me, as though someone, or something, were just outside, watching, waiting. I locked the door, shoving a chair against it, and returned to bed, pulling the covers over me, too terrified to move. The night was silent, oppressive, the air heavy with a sense of dread that made it impossible to sleep. The next night, the whispers returned, louder this time, calling to me from the darkness. They drifted through the walls, filling the room with an eerie, echoing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Please, let me in." The voice was filled with sorrow, a longing that made my heart ache, but it was laced with something darker, a hint of malice that sent a chill down my spine. I sat up, my mind racing, wondering if I was imagining things, if the isolation had finally gotten to me. But then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It started at the front door, then moved to the windows, circling the cabin, filling the air with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The voice continued, its tone pleading, desperate. "Let me in. Don't leave me out here." I backed away, clutching a blanket around me, my eyes fixed on the door. I could see a faint shadow just beyond the window, a figure standing in the snow, watching, waiting. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the shadow moved closer, pressing against the glass, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in." I spent the night huddled in the corner, too terrified to move, listening to the voice, the scraping, the slow, deliberate footsteps that circled the cabin until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things, threw them in the car, and left, my heart racing as I sped down the snowy road. But even now, months later, I can still hear the voice, faint but constant, echoing in my mind, pleading for me to come back, to let it in. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to the sound of soft whispers drifting through the walls, a reminder of the shadow that waits for me, hidden in the depths of the forest. The neighbor's window. When I moved into my new apartment, I was happy to find it had a view of the neighboring building, a beautiful old brownstone with tall windows and ornate balconies. At first, I didn't think much of it. The view was quaint, charming, and I enjoyed watching the daily lives of the residents as they went about their routines. But then, one night, I noticed something strange. There was a woman in the window of the apartment directly across from mine, standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in white, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, her gaze fixed on something outside. I watched her for a few moments, expecting her to move, but she remained still, staring out the window with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing, just a late-night reverie. But as the days passed, I noticed her more frequently. She was always there, standing in the same spot, her face obscured by shadows, her gaze unblinking, unmoving. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the window again, my eyes searching for her figure in the darkness. She was there, as usual, her silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight, her gaze distant, fixed on some invisible point beyond the glass. But then, as I watched, she turned, her face slowly coming into view. Her eyes met mine, piercing, intense, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I stumbled back, startled, my heart racing, but I couldn't look away. She held my gaze, her expression one of sadness, pleading, as though she were trying to convey something urgent. The next night, I watched again, feeling drawn to her, unable to resist. She was there, waiting, her gaze fixed on my window. And this time, she raised a hand, pressing her fingers against the glass, her expression shifting to one of desperation. "Help me," she mouthed, the words barely visible but unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, closing the curtains, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. But her face lingered in my mind, her desperate plea filling my thoughts, haunting me. The next morning, I decided to find out more about her. I asked the building manager if he knew anything about the woman in the neighboring apartment, but he looked at me with a blank expression, as though I were speaking nonsense. "There's no one in that apartment," he said slowly, his tone laced with confusion. That unit's been empty for years. I felt a wave of disbelief, my mind reeling, but he was insistent. The apartment was vacant, had been for a long time, and there was no record of anyone living there in recent memory. I went back to my apartment, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't resist. I stood by the window, staring at her apartment, waiting, hoping it had all been a trick of the light, my imagination playing games. But as the hours passed, I saw her again, standing in the window, her face filled with that same sorrow, that same pleading expression. She raised her hand, pressing it against the glass, her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a silent, desperate plea. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and I backed away, closing the curtains, trying to block out her gaze. I moved out shortly after, unable to bear the feeling of being watched, the memory of her sorrowful face haunting me. But sometimes, when I walk past that building, I glance up, half expecting to see her, her figure silhouetted in the window, waiting, watching, her silent plea echoing in my mind. And every now and then, I see her, a faint shadow in the window, her gaze fixed on me, a reminder of the plea I ignored, the woman I left behind in the darkness, the old doll in the closet. When I moved into my new apartment, I didn't expect to find anything unusual. It was a small, modest place, just what I needed to start fresh. But while unpacking, I found something strange. Tucked away in the back of the bedroom closet, hidden behind a stack of dusty shoeboxes, was an old porcelain doll. She had glassy blue eyes, delicate painted features, and a small, ornate dress that looked like it had been carefully hand-sewn long ago. I wasn't fond of dolls, especially one so unsettling, but something about her drew me in. Her eyes seemed to follow me, gleaming in the dim light. I tried to ignore her, placing her back in the closet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of her gaze, as though she were watching me from the shadows. The first night, I heard it, a faint, soft sound like the gentle tapping of tiny fingers against the closet door. I tried to ignore it, burying my head under the pillow, telling myself it was just the house settling, the wind, anything but the doll. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a rhythmic beat that echoed in the silence. Finally, I got up, my heart pounding as I approached the closet. I opened the door slowly, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting. But she was exactly where I'd left her, her glassy eyes staring straight ahead, her tiny hands resting delicately in her lap. I felt a strange urge to touch her, to pick her up, but a deep sense of dread held me back. I closed the closet door and went back to bed, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. But that night, I dreamt of her. Dreams filled with soft whispers, echoing through the darkness. A voice pleading, desperate, begging for release. Over the next few days, the tapping continued, growing louder, more deliberate, until it was impossible to ignore. Sometimes I would find her in different positions, her head tilted, her hands reaching out, as though she were moving, shifting, trying to escape the confines of the closet. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft whisper drifting through the silence. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. Help me. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I stumbled back, my heart racing as I stared at the closet. I felt her presence, a weight pressing down on me, filling the room with a heavy, suffocating dread. I knew deep down that she was trapped, waiting for someone to release her, to listen to her plea. In a moment of desperation, I took the doll and placed her in a box, sealing it shut, hoping it would silence her voice, her presence. I hid the box in the attic, far away from my room, hoping the distance would free me from her haunting gaze. But that night, I heard it again, a faint, muffled whisper drifting down from the attic, filling the air with a sorrowful, pleading sound. Her voice echoed through the silence, calling to me, reminding me that she was still there, waiting, watching, her plea for freedom lingering in the shadows. Even now, I can still hear her sometimes, her voice faint but constant, her whisper echoing in my mind, a reminder of the doll I left behind, trapped in the darkness, the visitor in the graveyard. There's a small, forgotten graveyard just outside my town, hidden behind a dense line of trees. It's the kind of place people avoid, a silent, overgrown patch of land filled with crumbling headstones and leaning statues. They say it's haunted, that spirits linger there, unable to find peace. I'd always been drawn to it, captivated by the stories, the sense of mystery that surrounded it. One autumn evening, just as the sun was setting, I decided to visit. The graveyard was bathed in a soft, golden light, the shadows stretching long and thin, casting eerie patterns over the graves. The air was cold, filled with the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the silence was absolute, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. I wandered through the rows of headstones, reading the names, the dates, feeling a strange connection to the people who lay beneath the earth. It was peaceful, almost serene, until I reached the far edge of the graveyard, where a large, crumbling mausoleum stood, half hidden by ivy and shadows. As I approached, I felt a sudden chill, a coldness that seeped into my bones, making my breath hitch. The air grew colder, filled with an unnatural quiet. I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to leave the graveyard and never return. But curiosity held me in place, compelling me to step closer, to look inside. Just as I reached the entrance, I saw her, a figure standing in the shadows, her face hidden, her body cloaked in a long, dark dress that flowed around her like mist. She was barely visible, her outline blurred and faint, as though she were part of the shadows themselves. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. She stood there, silent and still, her face obscured, but I could feel her gaze, a heavy, sorrowful presence that pressed down on me, filling the air with a sense of deep, overwhelming sadness. In a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke, her words soft and filled with longing. Stay. Please stay. Her voice was filled with sorrow, a deep, aching sadness that made my chest tighten. I felt a strange pull, an urge to stay, to listen, to understand her pain. But fear gripped me, holding me back, and I shook my head, taking a step away. She moved closer, her figure shifting in the shadows, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Please, don't leave me!" Her words echoed in the silence, each one laced with desperation, with a need that seemed endless, timeless. I wanted to help her, to understand, but something in her gaze, in the way she held herself, filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. I turned, running through the graveyard, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, her voice following me, growing fainter with each step. "Don't leave me, please, don't leave." When I finally reached the edge of the graveyard, I stopped, glancing back one last time. She was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving only silence, a heavy, sorrowful silence that lingered in the air, filling me with a sense of regret, of sadness, as though I'd left something behind. I don't visit the graveyard anymore, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear her voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the air, her plea for company, for solace, echoing in my mind, a reminder of the spirit I left alone in the darkness. The figure in the field. Growing up, I lived on the edge of a small town surrounded by wide open fields that stretched for miles. As a kid, I would often wander through those fields, exploring, letting my imagination run wild. But there was one part of the field I always avoided, a small patch of land near the woods where nothing grew. The grass was sparse and brittle, and no matter the season, the ground there was always dry and cracked. People in town called it the dead patch, and it was the subject of countless ghost stories. One summer night, feeling braver than usual, I decided to investigate. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the fields, and I could see the dead patch ahead, a dark, barren spot in the otherwise green landscape. As I approached, a chill crept over me, the air growing colder, thicker, filling me with a strange sense of unease. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the dead patch. It was barely visible in the dim light, its outline blurred and hazy, like a shadow that had come to life. The figure was tall and thin, its head tilted downward, its arms hanging limply at its sides. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, silent and still, like it had been waiting. I felt a surge of fear, but curiosity kept me rooted in place, watching, waiting. The figure lifted its head slowly, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, a heavy, unblinking stare that made my skin prickle. Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond, but it raised a hand, pointing directly at me. A chill washed over me, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a deep, bone-chilling fear that made it hard to breathe. Just as I was about to turn and run, the figure moved, stepping forward, its movements slow, deliberate, each step pressing into the brittle ground with a soft, hollow crunch. I backed away, my mind racing, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I was paralyzed, held in place by its gaze. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, the figure spoke. "Don't come back." The words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I bolted, running through the fields, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, the figure's voice lingering in my mind, filling me with a dread that clung to me long after I'd left. The next day, I went back to the field, hoping to convince myself it had all been a dream. But when I reached the dead patch, there was no one there, only silence, thick and oppressive, filling the air with a weight that seemed to press down on me, reminding me of the figure's warning. I don't wander the fields anymore, especially near the dead patch. But sometimes, when I pass by, I feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking, watching from the shadows. A reminder of the warning I ignored, the presence I left behind in the silence of the fields. The stranger at the bus stop. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was waiting at the bus stop after a late night at work. The street was empty, silent, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp above. The air was thick with mist, casting eerie shadows over the sidewalk, making everything feel muted, dreamlike. I was alone, or so I thought. But as I glanced around, I saw someone standing at the far end of the bus stop. A man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden beneath a hood. He stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on something in the distance, his presence filling the air with a strange, unsettling energy. I told myself it was nothing, just a fellow commuter. But there was something off about him, something that made my skin prickle. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, silent and still, as though he were waiting for something or someone. The bus arrived and I climbed on, eager to put distance between us. But as I took my seat, I glanced out the window and saw him again, standing by the bus stop, his gaze locked onto mine. My heart raced and I turned away, telling myself it was just my imagination. The bus was nearly empty, and I settled into my seat, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. But as we drove through the dark, empty streets, I felt it, a presence, heavy and unrelenting, as though someone were watching me. I glanced around, my gaze sweeping over the rows of seats. But the bus was empty, silent, save for the soft hum of the engine. Just as I was beginning to relax, I saw him again. He was standing at the next bus stop, waiting, his face hidden in shadow, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My pulse quickened, and I looked away, my mind racing, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But with each stop, he was there, standing in the shadows, his figure barely visible, his presence filling the air with a heavy, oppressive dread. It was as though he were following me, waiting, his gaze unblinking, his silence suffocating. Finally, the bus reached my stop, and I stepped off, my hands shaking, my heart pounding as I glanced around. The street was empty, silent, the mist clinging to the ground like a shroud. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was over, that I was safe. But just as I turned to leave, I saw him, standing at the end of the street, his figure barely visible in the dim light, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, filled with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Who are you? I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, watching, waiting. I backed away, my mind reeling, my pulse racing as I tried to make sense of it. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "I am coming." The words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a darkness, a sorrow that seeped into my bones. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and when I looked again, he was gone, vanished into the mist, leaving only silence. Since that night, I haven't taken the bus after dark, but sometimes, when I'm walking alone, I feel his presence, a weight pressing down on me, reminding me of his words, his gaze, his silent, relentless pursuit, the lights in the forest. As a child, my family lived near a large forest that stretched for miles, filled with thick trees and overgrown trails. It was beautiful but eerie, especially at dusk, when shadows stretched long and the dense trees seemed to close in. There were old stories in our town about strange lights that appeared in the forest at night. Flickering orbs that floated through the trees, glowing softly before disappearing without a trace. People said they were spirits, leading wanderers astray, but I'd never believed the tales. That changed one evening in late October. I was returning from a friend's house, walking down the dirt road that led past the edge of the forest. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the trees, and everything was silent, save for the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I was lost in thought, barely noticing my surroundings when I saw it. A soft light, just a faint glow, hovering between the trees. At first, I thought it was a firefly, or maybe a reflection of the setting sun. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The light was too steady, too bright, and it floated just above the ground, bobbing gently as though it were moving on its own. I stopped, staring, and the light seemed to notice me, drifting closer, its glow illuminating the trees in an eerie, pale light. I felt a strange pull, an urge to follow, and before I knew it, I was stepping off the road into the forest, my gaze fixed on the light. It moved deeper into the trees, weaving between trunks and over fallen branches, its glow flickering like a candle in the wind. I followed, feeling as though I were in a trance, the world around me growing darker, quieter, as I ventured deeper into the woods. After a few minutes, I realized I'd lost sight of the light. It had vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness, the silence pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to find my way back. But everything looked the same. Dark trees, twisted branches, shadows stretching long in the dim light. Then, just as I was beginning to panic, I saw it again. A faint glow just ahead, hovering between the trees. I felt a wave of relief, thinking it would lead me out, and I followed, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. But each time I got close, the light drifted further, leading me deeper into the forest, winding through narrow trails and dense thickets. Finally, the light stopped, hovering just above the ground, illuminating a small, open clearing surrounded by tall, twisted trees. I stepped into the clearing, feeling a chill crawl down my spine, and that's when I noticed them. Other lights, dozens of them, floating around the edges of the clearing, their glow casting strange shadows over the ground. I stood there, frozen, as the lights circled around me, their glow growing brighter, filling the air with an eerie, unearthly glow. They moved closer, closing in, and I felt a cold, hollow dread seep into my bones. I backed away, heart pounding, but the lights surrounded me, their glow flickering, their movement rhythmic, like a silent dance. Then I heard it, a soft, faint whisper drifting through the air, barely audible, but unmistakable. Stay. The word echoed in the silence, filling the clearing with a sorrowful, haunting tone. I felt a strange urge to stay, to let the lights surround me, but fear overpowered it, and I turned, running back through the trees, the lights trailing behind me, their glow flickering like ghostly lanterns. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, my breath coming in gasps, my heart racing. When I looked back, the lights were gone, leaving only darkness, silence, and the faint echo of that haunting whisper. And since that night, I've avoided the forest, too afraid of what lies within. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, I see them, faint glows, hovering at the edge of the trees, waiting, watching. Their soft light a reminder of the spirits that haunt the shadows of the woods. The stranger at the end of the hall. When I moved into my apartment, I was thrilled to have a place of my own. It was a quiet building, old but well kept, with creaky floors and tall ceilings. I quickly settled into a routine, enjoying the peace and solitude. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. I was brushing my teeth, my gaze drifting toward the hallway that stretched from the bathroom to my bedroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, a dark shape, standing at the end of the hall, its form barely visible in the dim light. I turned, heart pounding, but the hall was empty, silent, stretching into shadow. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the dark. But as the days passed, I saw it again and again, always at the end of the hall, watching, waiting. It was just a faint shape, barely visible, like a shadow that didn't belong. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I stood at the end of the hall, staring into the darkness, my heart racing, my mind filled with a strange, gnawing fear. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, thick and heavy. But then I saw it, the figure, slowly taking shape, its outline becoming clearer, more defined. It was tall, its face hidden in shadow, its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt a surge of fear, but I forced myself to stand my ground, refusing to let it scare me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, silent and still, its gaze piercing, unblinking. I felt its presence, a cold, heavy weight that pressed down on me, filling the air with a sense of dread that seeped into my bones. Finally, the figure raised a hand, pointing down the hall, its movements slow, deliberate. I turned, following its gesture, and saw nothing, just the empty hallway, stretching into shadow. But when I looked back, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving only silence, thick and oppressive. The next night it returned, standing at the end of the hall, its gaze fixed on me, its presence heavy, unyielding. This time I felt a strange urge to approach it, to understand, to listen. I took a step forward, then another, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions. But just as I reached the end of the hall, The figure moved, retreating into the shadows, its gaze lingering on me, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I called out, my voice trembling. But there was no response, only silence, thick and unrelenting. Since then, I've seen it almost every night, always at the end of the hall, always watching, waiting. I don't know what it wants or why it haunts me, but I can feel its presence, a weight that fills the air. A silent reminder of the spirit that lingers, waiting, watching, a shadow that will never leave. The phantom bell. There's an old, abandoned schoolhouse just outside my town. It's been closed for years, its windows boarded up, its walls cracked and crumbling. Local legends say that it's haunted, that the spirits of students who never left still roam the halls. People say that on quiet nights, you can hear the school bell ringing, echoing through the empty rooms, calling for students who never left. One autumn evening, on a dare from some friends, I decided to visit. We climbed over the rusted fence, making our way through the overgrown yard, our flashlights casting eerie shadows over the walls. The school loomed before us, silent and still, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching our every move. We reached the front door, and as we stepped inside, a chill washed over me, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The silence was absolute, oppressive, pressing down on us as we made our way through the narrow hallways. Each step echoed in the stillness, filling the air with a hollow sound that seemed to linger, as though the building itself were listening. We wandered through empty classrooms, our footsteps stirring up clouds of dust, our flashlights illuminating old desks and faded chalkboards covered in ghostly scribbles. The walls were lined with lockers, their doors hanging open, their insides dark and empty, filled with an eerie quiet that made my skin crawl. Just as we were about to leave, I heard it, a faint, distant ringing, drifting through the silence. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, filling the air with a haunting, echoing sound. My friends stopped, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear as we listened to the bell, its tone mournful, sorrowful, as though it were calling to us from somewhere deep within the school. We followed the sound, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls, our hearts pounding as the ringing grew louder, filling the air with a strange, unearthly energy. It led us to the old gymnasium, a large, cavernous space filled with shadows and silence. The bell rang again, louder this time, reverberating through the room, its tone filled with an urgency that made my chest ache. And then I saw them. Shadows, barely visible, flickering at the edges of my vision, moving through the gymnasium like memories brought to life. They were students, their forms faint and blurred, their faces filled with sadness, with a longing that seemed endless. One of them looked at me, her gaze unblinking, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it made my heart pound. She raised a hand, reaching out, her movements slow, deliberate, as though she were trapped, bound to the bell's haunting call. "Come with us," she whispered, her voice soft, barely more than a breath. A chill washed over me, and I backed away, heart racing, my mind reeling with fear. The bell rang again, louder, its tone filled with an urgency that seemed to press down on me, calling, pleading. I turned, running through the hallways, the sound of the bell following me, echoing through the empty rooms, filling the air with a sorrowful, haunting tone. When I reached the door, I glanced back, catching a final glimpse of the shadows standing in the hallway, their gazes fixed on me, their expressions filled with a sadness that seemed endless, timeless. We left the schoolhouse that night, the bell's mournful toll echoing in our minds, filling us with a dread that lingered long after we were gone. And even now, when I pass by that old, abandoned building, I hear it. The faint, distant ringing of the school bell, calling to those who will never leave, a reminder of the spirits that haunt its hollow halls. The face in the darkened window. There's an old mansion in my neighborhood, a towering Gothic structure with tall windows and iron gates. It's been empty for as long as I can remember, its walls covered in ivy, its windows dark and empty. People say it's haunted, that strange things happen inside, but no one ever goes near it. One winter evening, as I was walking home, I felt a strange urge to stop and look at the mansion. The air was cold, and a thick fog had settled over the street, casting eerie shadows over the houses. The mansion loomed ahead, silent and still, its dark windows watching like hollow eyes. Just as I was about to look away, I saw it, a face staring at me from one of the upstairs windows. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, pale and unblinking, its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The face remained, its expression solemn, its eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to press down on me, filling the air with a heavy, oppressive dread. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination, a trick of the light. But the face was unmistakably real, watching, waiting. I felt an overwhelming urge to go inside, to see for myself, to understand who or what was watching me from the shadows. But fear held me in place, and I turned, hurrying home, the memory of that face lingering in my mind, filling me with a dread that clung to me like a shadow. The next night, unable to resist, I walked by the mansion again. The fog was thicker this time, casting a ghostly glow over the street, and as I looked up, I saw the face again, watching from the same window, its gaze fixed on me. Its expression filled with a sorrow that seemed endless, timeless. I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach, and before I knew it, I was standing at the gate, my hands gripping the iron bars, my gaze locked onto the figure in the window. The face tilted slightly, as though acknowledging me, and I heard it, a faint, hollow whisper drifting through the silence, barely audible. "Come closer." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with fear. But the whisper grew louder, filling the air with a haunting, sorrowful tone, as though the figure were calling to me, pleading, begging me to listen. I turned, running down the street, the memory of the face haunting me, filling my mind with questions, with a dread I couldn't shake. I tried to avoid the mansion after that, to forget the face, but the memory lingered, a constant reminder of the figure watching from the shadows. Now, whenever I pass by that old mansion, I see it, the pale face in the upstairs window, watching, waiting, its gaze filled with a sadness so deep it seems to reach into my soul. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear the whisper, faint but constant, calling me back, a reminder of the spirit that haunts the shadows of the darkened mansion. The man in the cemetery. There's a cemetery on the edge of my town, an old, overgrown place that most people avoid. It's filled with towering gravestones, crooked and weathered by time, their inscriptions barely visible. The cemetery has an eerie reputation. Locals say it's haunted, that strange things happen there after dark. People claim to have seen shadows moving among the graves, heard faint whispers drifting through the air. I'd always been skeptical, dismissing the stories as nothing more than local lore. But one autumn evening, I decided to go. It was just before dusk, and a thick fog hung low over the ground, casting a ghostly glow over the cemetery. I wandered through the rows of headstones, the air cold and still, my footsteps muffled by the soft, damp earth. The silence was heavy, pressing down on me, filling the air with a quiet that seemed unnatural. As I reached the far corner of the cemetery, I saw him, a man standing by an old, crumbling gravestone. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, his figure barely visible in the fading light. His back was to me, and he seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I hesitated, watching him from a distance, feeling a strange sense of unease. I didn't want to disturb him, but something about him felt wrong, out of place, as though he didn't quite belong. I took a step closer, and the sound of my footstep echoed through the silence. The man turned slowly, his face hidden in shadow, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His eyes were dark, hollow, filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to reach into my soul. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me, his presence filling the air with a heavy, oppressive dread. I tried to speak, to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat. The man took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as though each step required an enormous effort. He raised a hand, pointing to the ground beside him, his gaze never leaving mine. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, filled with a sorrow that made my chest ache. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with fear. But the man continued to approach, his eyes fixed on mine, his hand outstretched, as though he were reaching for something only I could give. "Please, don't leave." The words echoed in the silence, each one laced with a desperation that seemed endless, timeless. I felt a strange urge to stay, to listen, but fear overpowered it, and I turned, running through the cemetery, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, his voice following me, growing fainter with each step. When I reached the gate, I glanced back, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me leave. But the cemetery was empty, silent, as though nothing had happened, as though he had never been there at all. I haven't returned to the cemetery since, but his voice haunts me, filling my mind with a sorrow that lingers, a reminder of the man I left behind in the shadows. And sometimes, when I pass by, I feel his gaze, heavy and unblinking, watching from the dark, waiting for someone to hear his plea. The unmarked road. There's an old, narrow road just outside my town that winds through the forest, a forgotten path that few people travel. It's hidden from the main road, almost overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, and most locals avoid it, saying it leads nowhere. People call it the unmarked road, and there are stories, strange, unsettling tales of people who took that road and never came back. One evening, out of curiosity, I decided to explore it. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the scent of rain, and as I drove down the narrow path, the trees closed in around me, their branches casting long, twisted shadows over the road. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires, and a strange, gnawing unease settled over me. The road seemed to go on forever, winding deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, their shadows darker. I thought about turning back, but a strange pull kept me moving forward, a compulsion to see where the road would lead. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached a clearing. The road ended abruptly, and there, in the center of the clearing, was an old, abandoned house. It was dark and crumbling, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, and the air around it was thick with an oppressive, heavy silence. I stepped out of the car, feeling a chill crawl down my spine, and approached the house, drawn by a strange, inexplicable pull. The door creaked open as I pushed it, revealing a dark, empty room filled with shadows. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the faint scent of something rotten. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and a faint whisper drifted through the silence, barely audible, like a voice speaking from just beyond the walls. I froze, heart pounding, straining to listen, and the whisper grew louder, filling the room with a haunting, sorrowful tone. "Come closer." The words echoed in my mind, each one filled with a sorrow that seeped into my bones, filling me with a strange, gnawing dread. I took a step back, my hand gripping the door frame, but the whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent, as though something or someone were calling to me from the darkness. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty house, filling the air with a heavy, oppressive weight. The whisper grew louder, filling my mind, and I felt a strange pull, an urge to stay, to listen, to understand. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped, replaced by a deep, hollow silence. I felt a presence behind me, a weight pressing down on me, and I turned slowly, my breath catching as I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow, deliberate, its gaze fixed on me with an unblinking stare. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the whisper returned, soft and faint, filling the air with a sorrowful, haunting tone. "Don't leave." The words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a desperation that made my chest ache, but fear overpowered it, and I bolted, running through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, the whisper following me, growing fainter with each step. When I reached the car, I glanced back, catching a final glimpse of the figure standing in the doorway, watching me leave, its gaze filled with a sorrow that seemed endless, timeless. I left the unmarked road that night, my mind filled with questions, with a fear I couldn't shake. And now, every time I pass by the narrow path, I feel its pull, a silent reminder of the spirit I left behind in the shadows, waiting, watching, hoping for someone to hear its plea.